The gaming panel. Not just gaming, but social gaming. Social gaming long before it became a term of art or the thing we know today, but compelling and addictive, flunking students out of the University of Illinois from time to time, and always facilitating really interesting social behavior. John Markoff is going to host this panel. And John, if you don't mind, I did a show of hands this morning about the overlap between last night and today, and it's about 98.2%. So I'm not going to do the long John Markoff bio, but just to say, as the technology writer for the New York Times based here in Silicon Valley, John's a friend of the museum and exactly the right guy to moderate this panel, so I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, John. So welcome, everybody. This is going to be fun, and I'm going to start with a confession, because I'm doing this panel largely because I'm a gamer, even at age 60. And I just wanted to say one tiny little bit about my own experience before we talk about their experience. And that was that as a probably junior in college in 1971, I walked into the coffee house at Stanford and sort of had my world turned upside down when I saw this, what was the first arcade game in the world. It was called Galaxy Game, but it was really Space War. And I had grown up in the television, as a child of television, and I all of a sudden realized that the world was interactive, and like in the space, in one epiphany, and it really had a huge impact on my life. What I still remember to this day is that there were a row of dimes lined up on the top of the ledge, because that was how you got in line, as you left your dime there. And so that had a tremendous impact on me. And so, but we're going to talk about gaming and PLATO, its personal and its societal impact, and I hope we can sort of extract some of the stories and, most importantly, the spirit of the community that PLATO created, and also get a little bit at its impact. And I'm going to start by introducing folks, and I guess I'm going to ask them to raise their hands because I think we're not quite in order here. But first, our first panelist is Bruce Artwick, who is with Artwick Consulting now, but Bruce founded Sublogic Corporation and Bow Inc., two pioneering companies in the computer gaming and simulation fields between 1977 and 1996. And of course, it includes Flight Simulator, what would become Microsoft Flight Simulator, and they sort of were the most, two of the highest impact programs for those of us who got into personal computing during the 1980s. And he's done other serious gaming simulations in space travel, control tower training, submarine simulation, and pinball. He has a master's and a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the University of Illinois, and he developed projects for the Digital Computer Laboratory and Aviation Research Laboratories at Illinois as well. And sitting to his left is John Daleske. He was the developer of Empire, the first network multiplayer arena shooter-style game in 1973 while he was a student at Iowa State University. So he was remote from the heartland of the PLATO empire. He also designed Dungeon and consulted on the design of Panzer, an interactive tank simulation. From 76 to 80, he worked for Control Data on their PLATO system as a courseware reviewer, developer, and a system programmer. He began the effort to add advanced language analysis capabilities to the system. More recently, he's worked as a telecommunications system engineer at both Bell Laboratories and more recently doing mobility engineering at Intermec. He's now an independent software consultant. And to his left is Brand Fortner. He's a research professor in physics at North Carolina State University now, and is considered an expert in accessible scientific visualization and in technical data formats. He previously was chief scientist of the Intelligence Exploitation Group of Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, and is the founder of two scientific software companies, including Spyglass. Dr. Fortner previously held positions at NASA and at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, and has written 2 books on color vision and technical data. Now, all the way down at the right is my co-moderator, I'll call him, Richard Hillman, who was not part of the PLATO community. He's now the Chief Creative Officer of Electronic Arts. He's our link to the present and maybe to the future. He's worked for Electronic Arts for 27 years, starting with Chuck Yeager's Flight Trainer. Richard has worked on more than 100 products and roles that varied from designer to producer to GM. Currently, he's the Chief Creative Officer and is focused on making a few titles better, making a few technologies possible, and making a few students gaming professionals. And then to my right is Andrew Shapira, who's now a software engineer, a principal engineer in transportation at Amazon. He grew up in Urbana. He was a student at the U of I. He is a legend in the gaming community, I'm told. This comes secondhand, but I believe he was at the top of all the relevant Hall of Fame rankings in the PLATO community. I've been told that you had a gamer name that was Blob. Is that the Blob? Sorry. Yeah. And there were actually pizzas named after him, that's definitely the stuff of legend. So his game is Avatar. He was a member of the group of designers who worked on Avatar, and so why don't we start? Actually, I'd like to start by asking our panelists each how you came to the PLATO community. And then just to say a little bit about your game, maybe an introduction on your game. And maybe if we could start with Bruce. How did you come to PLATO?
Well, unfortunately, I was never really involved in a real big way with PLATO, but rather used PLATO's technology to do some of the work that I was doing at aviation research laboratories. At the time, the displays that were in use were not raster bitmap graphics displays, and I think PLATO had one of the first really practical ones with the plasma panel. So at the laboratory, we had a plasma panel hooked up to Raytheon 704 and PDP-11 computers, and we used it for generating flight simulation graphics. So it was mostly just the technology that I was mostly involved with. One other thing in my career, at the university, I had, as an electrical engineering professor, Gene Slotto, who is co-inventor of the plasma panel, and that was a real honor. He had a lot of interesting anecdotes to tell us about that.
And was there a direct simulation linkage between Flight Simulator and stuff that happened?
Well, at aviation research laboratories, my main focus was computer graphics, and that's what my real interest was. But it was later on when I left the university and started a computer software company that I realized that there was a real possibility to do flight simulation using the graphics that I had generated. At the laboratory we had done it, and it was a lot of fun flying the simulators, and at a conference I gave a talk about that, and the audience just kind of gasped when I told them, I could hook this up to a flight simulation kind of thing that you fly around with your microcomputer, and it kind of set off an idea that maybe I could, so that's how it evolved.
We'll come back to that because Brand's brought up some things I want to go over. But let's go to John next. How did you come to PLATO?
Different from many of the other people here, I was at Iowa State University and just happened to find out about 2 PLATO terminals coming in, the very first 2 at Iowa State. In finding that out, I went and helped install those terminals and ended up becoming the very first student on. And it was near the end of the last quarter of the year, so it was a few weeks before the end of spring quarter in my sophomore year. And I started exploring. So I had about a week of exploring, digging into how PLATO worked. And at that time, public notes was not there, private notes was not there, P-notes. The way you communicated was with a program called PAD, which was just one screen full, and you had the ability to write a line or a couple lines, and at the bottom it would cycle back to the top, and that's how you communicated. Being remote, I didn't know how to get printouts, how to get lesson space, any of that, and or have any mentors to learn how to do tutor. So the way I learned tutor was through PLATO. The group of lessons called aids were so well done that I was able to learn it very quickly.
Brand, how did you come to PLATO?
Very typically, you've heard the story about, coming to PLATO, it's really exciting, then you beg and plead for a job, and my path was very, very typical there. And first took a class that used Plato, then Bonnie Seiler, Anderson Seiler, hired me. But actually, my primary reason that I ever got deeply involved in Plato was the fact that I wouldn't mind double anchovy pizzas. The reason why is that Bonnie was friends with David Anderson, who was one of the key architects of the Plato system. And David always liked double anchovy pizzas, and whenever he ordered them, I wouldn't mind eating with him, and so he finally hired me. So one of the things that, this has nothing to do with this session, one of the things we should bring up is the fact that there were a cadre of us junior programmers that existed on the 5th floor. You know, myself, Ray, Al Harkrader, Kim Mast, Larry White, a dozen of us or so, and we kind of had a little community there that we didn't realize at the time was absolutely unique. We would have parties up there and broadcast from the 5th floor of Searle, and it was very special, and we got a lot of trouble. But anyway, the game, my degree was in physics. I managed to graduate, but just barely. My interest was in using Plato as a way to do flight simulation, and I threw together a flight simulator, and it worked great. We'll talk more about that later.
Okay, great. And Andrew.
So this is the way I remember it. I was a fourth grader, just kind of minding my own business, and one day I saw these big, giant boxes, and I said, that's pretty cool. So that was my fourth grade Plato experience. In fifth grade, started using these things, and we got to use some of the games that we saw in the previous session. We played How the West Was Won and Speedway, and I thought they were awesome. So I was already trained even then to be a gamer. So that was maybe not an effect that the designers of those programs wanted. That's what happened. So that was the second level that I had experienced Plato. The third level was when I started, somehow between then and a year after that, some friends and I started hanging out in various places at the university where we had access to more stuff than that. And so we played a game called Subwar, which was really cool. It's kind of gotten to be a very obscure game. And after that, I got some author records and started writing code. So.
And I've heard that you had a particular obsession with speed, both performance.
I'm out of jail. I tried to. Yeah, it's absolutely true. I started typing fast, and then there was a guy in the foreign languages department when I was 13 who showed me this lesson called Debug, which measured your typing speed. And I had a great time in there, and I loved working at it. I have kind of an obsessive personality with this kind of thing, and that's where it was.
Okay. So, Richard, was Plato ever on your radar? You weren't an insider, but did you?
No. I grew up outside of Minneapolis, and so that's kind of CDC neighborhood. So we would continually brush up against it. I of course had, ending up where I have, it means that I've taken everything that was intended for good purposes and used it for poor ones. But that's what I'm here for. What got me into using computers was it got me out of math class in 4th grade. If I went down and used the terminal teletype that was hooked up to the University of Minnesota's timeshare system at that time, and I came back and wrote a, Hello World style program. It was good for 40 minutes out of math class, and that was 30 minutes of playing Civil War or Star Trek or something else. So the first games I played that were computer games weren't on a personal computer or weren't on a coin-op, but were actually that. The interesting thing was about once a quarter those of us who use the computers would get dragged off to be shown off to the other teachers around the school district as look at what we're doing, creating the computer programmers of the future. And they would always drop us in front of literally a random computer terminal with a random telephone and some random number that was probably wrong. And so the net effect that was sometimes it would end up being a very nice teletype, and a couple times it was a Plato terminal. And so those 2 times were the times that I actually got to see what everybody else was talking about it. My final brush was the job I had before I worked at Electronic Arts I was a computer operator at the Nevada test site for a company called Reynolds Electrical and Engineering, and the computer I operated was a CDC 6400. So for some reason, they followed me around everywhere I went, and so I played many hours of baseball on the console, for those of you who remember it.
Excellent.
I think a lot of people remember it.
So we've got a pretty good cross-section here. I wanted to start, though, from last night. When I brought up gaming with Don, I got the sense that he was slightly conflicted about the experience, and I wasn't sure what I had sort of dug up. And I was wondering if any of you had a perspective on the tension between gaming and education and sort of where they reinforced each other and where they pushed against each other.
So I do have some thoughts about this. I also couldn't help but notice that Brian last night could not help but give a little nudge wink when he mentioned games. And this is kind of a typical thing, and it's I think it comes there's different kinds of games. There's a game that has some kind of purpose that's viewed as legitimate, like the games we saw in the last session. And then there are games that are kind of just like for pure fun. And those are the games, I think, that generate the nudge nudge and the wink wink. But it's kind of a peculiar thing, because if you actually look what's in the games, you may learn more from something like, you don't know what you're going to get out of something beforehand. So my thoughts about this are kind of, or my experience on Plato was, there were a lot of people that felt like games were this disease to be eradicated. There were other people that just kind of let things go, and it was very interesting hearing Don last night talk about the fact that it was a conscious decision to allow this. I had no idea that was going on, and I think that's great that he had the foresight to do that and the willingness to do an experiment like that.
There may have been a little bit of planning in terms of, over the years, a reduction in the number of tips, thousands of instructions per second that you got in the foreground processing. So I don't know if that had a direct relationship to the number of games as they grew. I bet there was some aspect of that.
Did you think about tips back then? Was the phrase tips back then?
Yes.
That's amazing. that focuses the mind, doesn't it?
Thousands, not millions, not billions.
But not tens.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a different experience, and I can't speak in general about games. I think for people in the higher levels of Plato, we were the minions, and then there were the Bruce Sherwoods and the Don Bitzers. I think they treat us like kind of a necessary evil. We were there. It wasn't part of the mission, but it was part of the let 1,000 flowers bloom. But my game in particular was a real problem because it was so heavily computationally intensive. If 30 people were playing my game, we would use most of the processing power of $1 million system. We would bring the system to its knees. And so my game was only playable at night, late at night, and it was still not that, and there it is, not that well tolerated. What you're not seeing here in this screenshot is, if you see the radar in the lower left, this is where you're taking off. And I know for people that are used to games today where you've got fully 3D rendered background, but back in 1973, the fact that you saw these 3D displays was just, well, for us it was mind-blowing. But on that radar, the thing that made this a game was the fact you would see 30 other people in that were trying to shoot you down while you were trying to shoot them down. And the mistake I made programming this game, which I never fixed, was that every time you press next, it goes through the entire processing cycle and calculates everything, and so you could fly faster by pressing next faster, which of course racked up the usage on $1 million computer system. So,
the nickname was Next War.
So I was not a friend of the system.
I think flight simulators kind of come at it from a different direction. They are actually originally training devices that turned out to be a lot of fun and usable as games. And although when I had stuff done for Microsoft, we never really could officially say that we had a training device on our hands and that it was educational. A lot of studies at universities showed that there was a lot of learning transfer from it, and it was fun at the same time. So it's an example of sort of the other way around.
Richard?
I think this started then and still isn't over today. Parents' attitude, myself included, toward video games is ambivalent at best in some circumstances. The way I would describe it is the relationship between broccoli and ice cream. we all know that broccoli is better for us than ice cream. Who would like to have a big helping of broccoli right now? Long list. Oh, good. We got right. Good job. How many would like to have ice cream right now? Okay. See, that's the issue really is, and I'm the product of two teachers. What teachers see is that if you have ice cream on the table at the same time you have broccoli, nobody eats the broccoli. And so I understand the problem. At the same time, sometimes you can make broccoli look like ice cream too. And I think that one of the fellows of this place is a guy named Steve Wozniak, who was fortunately one of the first people I met when I moved here. And he's got a famous phrase that I remember him saying, which was, "Those who think that education isn't about entertainment don't know anything about either." And I'm not so sure he's not right.
So this is the perfect group to ask this question of. So I came into the PC era working at InfoWorld in the early 1980s. And there was this company called Infocom. And they commercialized some of the first MUDs. And what I still remember to this day was they had a company slogan which was, "The best graphics are in your head." And I still love this to this day because I walked into, I guess, probably a Sony entertainment store a couple of years ago, and I probably looked at an EA game and I said, "Holy moly, this is no longer true." But I wondered if you could take that phrase and sort of think about it in the terms of the games that you guys were designing, because there was something about that experience that required a level of individual fantasy. You did have to have you had to sort of have a willing suspension of disbelief to really get engaged in the games. Was that a big part of it?
I would say yes, in a degree. The other aspect, though, is you have to consider the technology at that day. My computer science classes, I was also handing in decks of cards and waiting for a day to get the answer back that I typed something wrong. Whereas on Plato, you got instant feedback either as a programmer, developer, or as a student. It was completely different. So now you had at least rudimentary graphics that you could work with. Yeah, compared to today's graphics, it's night and day different. But there's still an active group that play these games today because there's something else compelling about them.
Do you have a sort of a viewpoint on realism as a person who sort of has excelled at simulators?
Well, yeah, I think you have to meet a certain threshold of realism for something to be usable. A good enough frame rate, a good enough visual representation. But I think that threshold is really pretty low because your mind kind of takes what's there and interpolates the rest. And this shot is from a TRS-80 computer, which was 10 years after the Plato screen, but had a much lower resolution. And people still had a lot of fun flying it and actually got a feeling of a real flight experience out of it. And if you take today's graphics, which are extremely realistic and getting more so every day, it's nice. It's a lot of eye candy, and it looks really nice. You can see shimmering on lakes and everything now. But I think from the user experience, a lot of that was already there once you met that minimum threshold.
And it's amazing you could do that on a TRS-80.
Yeah, that's
character
a job.
graphics.
Andrew, and then
So an important,
Brand, I'm
an
sorry.
important point there is that there are elements of immersion other than graphics. So specifically, one thing you can do is create a sense that there's a depth to the game that's hidden, that you don't see, but you kind of can sense is there. So there's always more to the game than what you see. That has a big effect on what it's like to play the game.
And were you thinking about that as a designer?
Absolutely.
Right from the beginning?
Yep.
Interesting. But you were sort of making that up as you went along. You didn't have any reference point to go back to.
I wouldn't say at the very beginning we were thinking about that, but as it went on, this kind of became clear. It became clear that this was a good thing to do.
There were other dungeon games prior to Avatar to follow from.
Bran.
I just have a comment about fidelity because that affects both Bruce and I in that I remember reading an article about people after phonographs first came out, Einstein's original phonographs, and people were tested, and they said that they could not detect the difference between an Edison phonograph and a real performance. So clearly the standard that they had about audio fidelity back in the 1910s is radically different than our standard fidelity then. And for them, they got the same enjoyment out of that Edison phonograph that we do out of high fidelity. So it's, the history of audio fidelity has been a march to be more and more, better and better. And so our standards get higher and higher. And if you listen to a phonograph from the 1910s, it sounds horrible to our modern ears. The same thing has obviously happened with flight simulators. Nobody today would play Airfight because it's not the experience that you expect. But the experience that you had at the time, as Bruce said, I think was very similar.
And let's turn to your
Can
use
I
of.
add, can I add one quick thing to
Go
that?
ahead. Yeah.
So when in the world of creating aircraft, they have something they call pilot load, and it describes the amount of information that they have to accumulate to operate the aircraft.
Right.
And so how the display systems portray that stuff is a part of it. I make the case there's an imagination load in games, that people can use a certain amount of their imagination to create the world in their head that they're playing in, and they can use a certain amount of that imagination to play the game. And so what you're doing is you're distributing that imagination against the workload of imagining the context of the world that I need to accumulate, and then turning that into the tactics and strategies that I use to play the game. In the world of making football games, something I'm kind of known for, what I noticed happen was once we got the fidelity to the point where people perceived the player's motion as being tactically accurate, they stopped using their imagination to imagine what the players looked like and started to use it to imagine how to play the game in a different way. And in the last couple of years, Wired did a great article I had nothing to do with, but did a great article about how Madden had changed football and how people had done things on the computer game that they then did in real life and had the ability to imagine it in the computer game because their workload was lower. So they knew that with 8 seconds left in the clock, if they had had a 10 or 12 yard lead on somebody going down to the end zone, that instead of crossing the line, they should turn right and burn the last 7 seconds off to keep from having that, giving your opponent the opportunity to win. I'd make the case that's because their imagination load had been transferred from graphics to playing the game. And so what I think was true for us is we had customers that had really big imaginations. So their imagination load was more capable of that distribution. What we see now is people playing games at literally every layer of society, ranging from the Farmvilles of the world to what we do to telephone games. And those who don't know, telephone games proliferate outside of the United States beyond your belief. What people have different amounts of imagination they can deploy against that. And I think what we saw at that time was we were expanding the imaginations of the players at that time.
Brand, I wanted to ask you about sort of soaking up of the resources of the machine that you had at that time, and give us set the context.
Yeah, again, my game was a little special because my background was physics. The flight simulator was done using 3D vectors and 3D matrix calculations. One of the things I didn't realize until I thought about it in the last few days was that the reason why Airfight existed in 1973, 1974 was because of Seymour Cray. Seymour Cray, most of you know, designed supercomputers. He was also the designer of the computer that ran PLATO, and because of that, it had an incredibly powerful floating point processor. The 60-bit floating point words were, today, it's standard to have 32-bit floating point words, which meant that there was not that much distinction between doing an integer calculation and doing a floating point calculation. We didn't know that. We just thought tips is tips. Okay, so those 1,000 instructions per second could refer to integer instructions or it could refer to floating point instructions. So something like Airfight was possible using, just barely, was possible using 10,000 instructions per second because they were floating point. It wouldn't have been possible on other types of computers. And in fact, in 1976, when the Apple II came out and people were saying you should port this to the Apple II, I said it is flat out impossible to do a flight simulator on the Apple II. It can't be done. It doesn't have a floating point processor. You couldn't do it. It's impossible. And of course, Bruce.
You weren't listening, were you, Bruce?
Bruce, just a simple explanation.
How did you do it?
Well,
I've always wanted to know.
Well, you know, the fact that Brand did it almost 10 years earlier, well, maybe not 10, maybe 5 years earlier, kind of does lend credence to how powerful the PLATO system and the processor was. But actually, I had done this sort of thing on mini computers, so, you know, it's very well optimized assembly language kind of work. But, you know, comparing the processing power of the early mini computers to the chips that were coming out at the time, the Z80 and 6502, I began realizing they were similar computing power. And I knew it was possible. It's just a matter of how to make it happen. And like I said before, the early displays were very primitive, and that's what made it possible. And one thing that was always imperative in my mind that throughout the development through the years people tried to change was I wanted to keep the frame rate high enough to actually be dynamic enough for people to use as a flight simulator. There's always a temptation to make it look, the graphics look much, much better, but cut back on frame rate. So that's one thing that we always had to keep in mind, keep that frame rate up and sacrifice image quality in place of it.
Ned Lerner built the Chuck Yeager flight trainer, and Ned's analysis was, Bruce has got a good math package.
So, you know, in 15 or 20 minutes, I'm going to open it up for the whole audience. So if you have questions, think of them, keep them. We'll come back to it. You know, one of the things that's sort of come up here is that some people are gamers and some people aren't. And I just wondered, you guys have all been in it deeply enough. Do you understand why some people are gamers and some people aren't? Does anybody have a...
No.
Maybe I'm asking the wrong crowd.
Actually, let me just mention briefly, I think I'm definitely not a gamer. And one of the reasons I wrote Airfight, I actually am a pilot now, and I was learning to be a pilot at the time. I wanted to write a game I could win. And after I wrote Airfight, I couldn't win at my own game. What I found was interesting was people were using maneuvers that are not physical. You wouldn't do in a real plane, but they were doing it because the game allowed it. And they were winning against me.
So as the designer, did you think about cheats?
I never did that, but yes, I did think about it.
I had the same experience doing different versions of Empire. I would play it mainly just to make sure it was playable, but everybody out there beats me. I get on today, I die in about a minute.
That's remarkable.
That's actually normal. I mean, you know, we would, I think in the history of me making games, I remember we had internal tournaments on games that I designed and produced on 3 different occasions, and all 3 occasions I came in last. Not first, but last. And the reason is you play the game the way you intended it to be played,
right,
not the way it can be played.
Yes.
And so it's you know, those who discover the exploits are the winners, and inevitably that's what happens. So there's a certain purity to the game that we make, and then there's the way people play them.
Yeah, we have in our mind all those roadblocks that, well, it can't be done that way.
So the good news about network-oriented game design is we can go fix those things.
I think most people out there think that the people who write games, entertainment programs, like Brand and I, are real gamers, and that's not necessarily true. I think everybody has a certain, liking for games or not, and just like Brand, I don't consider myself a gamer at all. I hardly play any computer games, but I was more interested in the graphics and the physics of flying. So it depends on the person, I think.
I think the word
similar to me, I played Airfight probably at least as much as I did Empire.
I think what's interesting is the word gamer gets in the way. Mm-hmm. So in our business, we're starting to run away from the word, not because we don't like the word, but because we think it doesn't define the audience that we have. So we have a service called Pogo. I was kind of alluding to this earlier. Pogo, we have 1.2 million or something like that subscribers on it. And the predominant, and I mean predominant customer, is a 48-year-old woman. And if you ask her if she's a gamer, she will say no. And you look at her usage, and it's 24 hours a week. I got news for you. I got console gamers don't play remotely that much. So that word means something very specific. It means gaming lifestyle. It means that I'm a PlayStation 3 owner, and I tell everybody I'm a PlayStation 3 owner. What gamer means today is that I might play Solitaire, or I might play Farmville, or I might play a network game that I play with my kids on Pogo, or I might play cards with my 3 sisters every Friday, and we talk about our families. They don't think that that's gaming, and to me that's just as important as anything. And I think Plato, among other things, have made that so normalized people don't even define it as the same thing anymore.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wanted to ask about the online gaming, now I'm using the word again, community. I saw references to both marriages and divorces in the community, and I wanted to ask about the gender breakdown during the first decade or so. How skewed toward male was it? How many?
The vast majority of Avatar gamers were male, but there were some female gamers, and they were extremely persistent to the point where someone told me the other day that they went in a few years ago, and one of the women who was playing who had started in maybe 79 was still playing. So hopefully she stopped for a little while to eat.
John, what's your recollection?
I would say it's a high percentage of males, similar to what you experienced in the computer science or math or physics and departments. As that has evolved to be more balanced, I think you find probably more people wanting to play games. So, it's really evolved from that, but at that time, I think a high percentage.
Ben?
It was one of the nice things about Plato was that in terms of the user population, it was pretty evenly matched. In terms of the hardcore games like we're talking about, I think he's right. It was preferentially male, but there were actually thousands of games on Plato. We haven't talked about that, but there were lots of them. The typing game, what was that? Typomatic or Depot?
Mm-hmm. There were 10 or 20 typing games.
120 typing games. There were thousands of games. I think if you look at some of the other games, I think you'd find a much different ratio.
Right.
And then how did the virtual community, the actual online gaming community, blur into the physical community? You all were telling me stories about sort of the social quality of the community that emerged outside the game experience. What do you remember about sort of what, you talked about going to meals together, doing things socially together.
Well, a good example of that is, I wasn't at this particular meal, but it was a story posted back actually in the early 80s. This group, after playing Empire all night long, they had decided to go out to breakfast, which they did almost every night. Forced preventive maintenance was at 6 a.m., so they would go to this restaurant, have breakfast. They were, of course, pumped up, excited. This was a team that had been playing and pushing off, forcing off the Federation at one point. They were attacking Earth, and they kept them off. And another point, the Romulans were trying to come in and take over the system, and they had pushed that back. They ended up being somewhat loud during the breakfast, being so excited about it. Well, an elderly couple was finishing their breakfast, and as the husband was going up to pay, the wife came over to the table and said to them, "I really don't understand what you were doing, but I want to just thank you for saving the Earth." That gives you an example of how immersed people were getting into it at that time.
That's great. And relationships persisted outside. Were these? Where did the line? Was there no line? You actually did. Is it true you met your wife online?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. And in a gaming situation, just in Plato.
It wasn't a gaming situation, but we were both working at Control Data. She was in Ohio. I was in Minnesota, and I was helping her with one of the medical lessons so that she wouldn't kill the patient when she was demonstrating to doctors. And we ended up talking, and we got married later that year, and we're still married.
That's great.
She's out in the audience.
That's great.
So she's
was
a
it one of
Plato
the
person.
Do you know of any prior online romances to yours? Were you patient?
I'm not aware of any marriages, but I wasn't in the Searle environment, and there may well have been others there that happened prior to 1977. I would expect so. There were also other types of issues that went on with the social aspects of gaming.
Okay. Was it I asked this question last night, but was your, the gaming development culture of Plato, was it a hacker culture? In the sense, well, I associate it with Stephen Levy's book, the communities of programmers that emerged at both MIT AI Lab and at SAIL.
Yeah, in the positive sense of hacker.
Yeah,
yes.
in the original sense of the word, not in the.
Yeah.
But that's also the way we program the system too.
Yeah.
So
it
was all the same.
It all blurred to.
Yeah. As I mentioned to you before, the sort of environment we had at Plato, that the entire freewheeling let 1,000 flowers bloom, I've only experienced twice in my life. Once was in the Plato community when things happened out of Plato that were not planned, and also at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, where things that were definitely not planned came out of that. And
So is that a rule? How far can you take that?
Well, I'm only one person. I've only experienced it twice. What Don Bitzer and then Larry Smar, who you know, did to create those environments, I don't know. You should take them both in a room and figure out what's similar between those two individuals who are very different in many ways.
So I want to talk a little bit right now about how Avatar started, because this is gets to your question. So in Searle, there were two rooms, Room A and Room B, which were sort of public. A lot went on in those rooms. I hear some laughing. And so a lot of the junior high and high school students, and I was one of these, would go in there, and especially on weekends, and they'd be working on some program or other. And it was kind of like fashion, you know, what kind of thing are you working on today? So at one time, there was a fashion for dungeon games. So you go in there, and there would be 10 people, each working on their own little dungeon game. And be like, somebody would be working on a maze runner. There was one guy that wrote this 3D thing. It was extremely creative. You could rotate the whole world, and then you kind of fall, but there were monsters in it somehow. Just crazy stuff going on. So one day I saw a guy named Bruce Maggs in there. He was working on a thing called a maze runner, which about like half the people in there were working on maze runners. This was like a fashionable thing. And so I said, hey, Bruce, can I work on that a little bit? So I worked on it for a while, and I made it a little bit better. And then he worked on it for a while, and then we added on some more stuff. And pretty soon we had a little bit of a game. And eventually Dave Sides got involved, and this went on for about a good 2 years, and then we opened it.
And was Maze Runner separate but equal? You know about Maze Wars? There was a game called Maze Wars.
Maze Wars is a different kind of thing. Maze Wars is a 2D kind of game where you race your opponent across a board. A Maze Runner is you picture yourself with a 3D view, a first-person view of a dungeon, and you can run around in a predefined maze, or in the case of Moria, a maze that's generated on the fly. So they actually had an infinite Maze Runner, which is very cool.
Wizardry or Bard's Tale. Wizardry or Bard's Tale style.
And the goal was to find someone or to...
Well, the goal was to get a working Maze Runner.
How'd you do?
We got one. Yep.
Good. That's great. What about violence? I mean, what seems to me what's emerging from my look at the range of games that were in the Plato community, it was not about shoot 'em ups. There were shoot 'em ups, but it was much more diverse. But were there issues about game violence in the early days of Plato? Did that come up on the were there ethical issues that bubbled up?
For me, there were, partly because of the fact that most of the games were basically pitting teams against each other to go out and kill each other. The design of Empire, really, the first version of it was a strategic level game, and the intention was it was simulating, kind of like Sims was something 10 years later. I was doing similar to Sims in that first version of Empire, strategic level, building economies. Having a planetary commander, the person was trying to build up the economy. That first version wasn't tactical, didn't have spaceships that moved around very much. You could send them to another planet and either attack or trade goods. And that's why I moved into the second version, which was fully tactical, but didn't have the strategic aspect to it. The third version also was more tactical, and then Empire 4 was where we finally brought things back together a little bit with some strategic level and the tactical, but it still was all violent. And what I was actually trying to get back toward was something where you as a player had the option of choosing to go into the war aspect of it, or also you could win by choosing to go into the let's trade and build economy side. Didn't succeed in that side of it.
And there's so many games that seem to be derivative from your original. Are they in fact derivative?
There are, yes. It's hard to say how they're derivative. The one aspect that you can look at, for example, X-Trek in the 80s was built on Sun X Windows systems. I had no knowledge of it being developed at the time, but the commands that they're using are the exact same commands that you used to play Empire, including the one unique telltale is the arrows on a PLATO keyboard are circled around the S key, and they still use that in Xtrek. NetTrek in the 90s, which was developed onto the internet, has that first version had the same command sequences, so it evolved there.
But there are also, today there are these massively multiplayer games that also seem to be based on, I mean, they're very high visually, I can't remember the name now.
Very high visual acuity, is that what you're saying?
But they seem to have the same basic underlying, you trade and or you can fight, but it all seems to go back to Empire.
I don't know what the direct connection is, but yes. Yeah.
I
Empire
know
was the
I
start.
know a big fan of yours was Chris Crawford. I'm not sure if you know who Chris is. But
No.
Bruce knows who Chris is. Bruce is probably the first guy in the video game business to write a real book about game design called The Art and Science of Video Game Design. Chris is best known for Eastern Front and a bunch of war games. And so he had to, being kind of an Atari 800 guy really at his core, he was limited by the character graphics at the time, but he was a big PLATO player. He used to tell me about it all the time. I want to come back to the violence thing, because we live with this today, of course. I think what's interesting is violence and action are words that run together in general in our business. And I think that violence and action and frame rate are cousins. If you don't have a frame rate of a certain capability, there's only so much action you can portray and only so much violence that frankly is satisfying in any fashion. And so I think what's happened is it is a combination of it coming from an educational perspective, but the simple fact was it wasn't a 10 frame per second device very often, and so it makes it not really possible to do Street Fighter or anything like that in that kind of context if things become more strategic and more abstract.
Graham.
Going back to violence, when my very first version of Airfight didn't have the interactivity, and it was just frankly boring because the graphics were such. I mean, today with flight simulators, you can fly around virtual worlds, and it's exciting. Here, we just have lines. It's boring. It wasn't until I added the fact that you could shoot other people down, all of a sudden it became a runaway success.
How many times did you get asked where are the guns?
Well, in the first versions of Flight Simulator, I had a real dilemma whether there should be some sort of a shoot 'em up kind of game in there. And in version 1, I put a game called British Ace. It was a World War I game with fighters and everything. But time kind of told that it was more the flying around that people were interested in, and later on, those kind of games were eliminated from the basic flight simulator. Of course, there were fighter jet simulators that people liked, but I think they were more interested in the dynamics of flying a jet rather than the shoot 'em up aspect of it.
Well, actually, for me, the difference is when you're playing a game where you're playing against a computer opponent, it's one thing. But the thing that was unique about Airfight is you're actually playing against other people.
Oh, right.
And there was a certain satisfaction about killing somebody else, a real person.
Especially if you knew who they were.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And that's why, because of my programming mistake, that you could go faster if you pressed Nix faster. It became a very, very fast-paced game.
That's true. That almost is a real-time game. We did, I think you may even remember this, we did a game with an English company called F-16 Combat. And it was very similar to Falcon in that it had a RS-232 two-player mode.
Right.
And what inevitably happened was, first of all, the first rule we had was no missiles, because missiles are no fun. If you shoot somebody who's a dot on your screen, what fun is that? So we had the guns-only rule. Inevitably, those would turn out to be two guys running out of gas, trying to shoot each other down while they're out of gas.
I want to mention a small anecdote. Before I worked on Airfight and before I was on the system staff, I worked for Bonnie Anderson. Bonnie. And one of the programs that I was given to program, nobody else would program, and it was called Ant War. And what you had is you had little matrices of ants, and if your matrices of ants was bigger than the other matrices of the ants killed each other, and then what was left over. And it was to teach elementary education, but nobody else would touch it. I programmed it. It was great. It was fun to make animations with ants body parts would fly all over the screen.
What could be better?
Well, I agree that multiplayer really adds a lot to the interaction of people, and you get a lot of satisfaction shooting at each other and that sort of thing. But in a single-player environment, I never had that. But one thing I have to say on the first version of British Ace, when I was doing the programming on it, I too had a programming bug, and when you came down on an airfield, enemy airfield, the enemy was supposed to scramble and attack you. And I had a sign there on one of my programs, and I came down on the enemy airfield, and they all took off and ran. And I had a lot of satisfaction about that.
During the period, the early period, did you guys have any evidence that game design was driving hardware at all? I mean, not hardware in terms of consumption, but the design of hardware. Was there any? Did you see the hardware world respond to anything you guys were doing, aside from capacity? I mean, there's a capacity issue, but
Oh, definitely. I mean, one of the things that the development of IBM PC clones, they used Flight Simulator as a test for hardware compatibility, and we actually were finding bugs in IBM's hardware because I was pushing the hardware right to the limits and the timing on some of their hardware. And I think especially over the years, the graphics is strictly gaming that really pushed that to the levels of inexpensiveness and complexity that it is today.
There's actually a great story. He was basically the those of you who don't remember, but he was the certification program for your IBM PC compatibility. It was actually PC Magazine used to have a column that said FS compatibility, and it was a check mark. Everybody had to have. So I remember the Sanyo PCs. Remember the very first Sanyo PCs? They didn't run anything else, but they ran Flight Simulator. and they did it by cheating every way from sunshine. They basically looked, I'm now running Flight Simulator, ignore when he tells me to do this, I'm going to do this instead. So I would say that what we see in front of us is one of the greatest examples of that. It's not at all clear to me that computers would have evolved displays that look like this if it hadn't been for games. I don't think, with all due respect, I do not think education would have driven color displays. I do not believe it would have driven real-time displays. I do not believe it would have driven high-resolution displays. I think that it's the interest in entertainment, and games and computers is the most kind of vibrant and visible portion of that entertainment that has made this stuff possible. And Plato is maybe the first incarnation of that we ever saw.
Now, to answer your question in a slightly different way, I heard a story, I don't know how true it is, but there are probably people here who could answer it, and that was, I've heard that the systems programmers used a version of Empire and maybe Airfight at various times to actually test the system. I don't know that for sure, but I have heard that that's a rumor.
to shift from the architectural to the psychological, there was a reference to people flunking out of school when we started. And I wanted to ask you about the notion of addiction. And,
is this when
would you use...
Is this when I leave?
You don't have to. But I mean, does anybody think it's physiological? What is the obsession that you guys must have seen it in the people who were taken away by your games?
For quite a while, I felt a sense of karma because I knew people personally who flunked out or got divorced, and it really did weigh on me for a while, and that's why I tried to go toward. If I was going to design a game, I wanted to have some level of social responsibility in what I came up with. Later, I decided that there's also an aspect of personal responsibility that a person individually needs to have in their own addictions, whether it's one addiction or another. And if you look at the general population, it seems as maybe 10% of the population has an addictive personality, whether it's games, alcohol, gambling, or whatever. There's a personal aspect to that that's not the game designer's karma.
Other thoughts?
You're going to make me answer, aren't you?
I'd love yours.
One of the most vibrant things in the gaming business today that gets a lot of attention is what they call social games today. So we own a company called Playfish, and there's Zynga that makes stuff like that, which has many of my friends who used to work at Electronic Arts. As you may or may not have heard, I used to live in Las Vegas when I was a kid, we had one of the game designers from Playfish come in and talk to us about how they do what they do, and about 20 minutes in, I figured out what was going on. Essentially, what they're doing is building compulsion systems, and compulsion systems are fundamentally how slot machines work. They're how a lot of things in this life work, and so the video games that we make are compulsion systems, and sometimes they operate on people in ways we don't intend to, and sometimes they operate the way that we do. What's new, and I think what was one of the functions that Plato brought to this, is that if you think about those social gaming systems, the slot machines, what they don't pay off is in monetary currency, they pay off in social currency. And Plato was a community where social currency was way more important. What you did and how you contributed to that society was way more important than what you achieved or what your monetary status was. I think that's what you see in these current generation of games. So those compulsion, the question is it or is it not a compulsion system? They all kind of are at some level. By the way, golf is a compulsion system, for those of you who play it. But at the bottom of it, it's what does it make you do, and then how do you react to that, and how do you express yourself in your context. And that's that personal responsibility component you're talking about.
Yep.
But ultimately, they are designed to make you come back. That's what we're trying to do.
So now, to correct one aspect, I'd like to ask Andrew. I did hear that there maybe actually was a real monetary aspect to Avatar that other Plato games did not have. I don't know if you want to talk about that. Or not.
People did occasionally trade items for money, I think. I don't know too much about what went on there. That wasn't supposed to be a joke.
Perhaps there was an underground economy.
There definitely was.
Yeah.
It could have been, well, it was probably one of the earliest examples of an online economy where actual money traded hands. Not, it's like an early eBay, you can think of it as.
Or World of Warcraft. So World of Warcraft today, for those of you who don't know, somewhere in China right now are several hundred gentlemen sitting at computer monitors mining gold for customers in North America. So it's kind of an early instance of that.
I want to talk about another compulsive aspect of Plato. So Plato had one of the greatest addiction-generating devices known to man. It's called the Hall of Fame. and the Hall of Fame is a very simple and powerful idea. It's simply a list of, it's a high score list. There's a name and a score. If you do this well, you get place number 5. If you do great, you get number 1. Then you come back tomorrow and you're number 3, and then you place some more and you go number 1 again. It's unbelievable how effective that is.
Now, is that a compulsion system? That's
Absolutely,
okay.
absolutely. And by the way you can test it is, who's the guy who works the hardest? It's not Hertz, it's Avis. Number 2 always works the hardest. So that's how you could always tell. All those high score lists, the person to watch is always number 2.
Just a historical point of reference here on the issue of online economies. At a hackers conference a number of years ago, Les Ernest asserted that the first online transaction was a drug deal that happened between MIT students and sales students over the ARPANET sometime in the late 1960s.
Oh, I think that's actually too late.
Is that too
As somebody who knew the computer operator community of the CDC, I find it hard to believe it took that long.
Okay. I'm looking for other
I have no direct evidence otherwise.
Good.
I hear a CDC operator giggling in the stand, so I may have known some of you.
So, back to the social community question again. Did the communities persist and extend beyond the games in any cases? Did communities that were, aside from individual relationships, can anybody think of communities that emerged from the gaming world that took on a physical life unto themselves?
It's hard to say. When Cyber One brought Plato back to the world, because when I left Plato in the early 80s, I thought I'd never see a Plato system again. When it came back, it was just amazing to me that there are people who have gotten on there and play Empire and Avatar constantly. Those people who wanted to be, they were Klingons or Orions or I don't know why anybody would want to be a Romulan, but they were.
I like to be a Romulan.
I always had the coolest stuff.
That's an inside joke.
I always played Romulan.
You always did? Well, that's why you lost.
But they were strong.
But those, as you can tell, those feelings are still there.
We should do a survey of how many played Romulan.
Well, Orions were the best, but.
Let's use this as an opportunity to open it up. If there are people, I don't know if we have microphones, but if there are people who would like to join, we do have microphones. So if you can get a microphone, we have a question here.
Well, I was a Romulan High Commander for about a year and a half. But I wanted to, one, thank you for Empire and thank you for all your work. It was remarkable. Just transformative for me. I had it in a neurosciences lab for 4 years. But one of the things about Empire, particularly the social aspect of it, that I'd love you to elaborate on, because you allowed for direct ship-to-ship communication,
Yes.
within civilization communication, and all-universe communication, as well as ongoing community boards, of which the high commanders, had some degree of authority. And that was really exceptional for drawing together disparate people spread throughout the network who
Right.
rarely saw one another, but who collaborated for strategic and tactical advantage, as well as the interpersonal relations.
It was a wonderful community that on Cyber One still exists. It's remarkable. And by the way, I don't mean to.
He likes Romulans too.
Well, the reason I like the Orion ship is because I designed all the ships, but I specifically designed the Orion ship to be real tiny because I was out of space in terms of the care set. So I only had 8 characters to work with. And that's why I came up with that little tiny ship, but it just made me feel like this thing can really fly. It's not very strong, but it can move fast.
Yes. I was programming at night over the summers, like David Frankel mentioned earlier. But I'd come down to the several rooms and I'd watch the gamers. And sometimes I'd play myself. And it was interesting to see all these people who were addicted, really addicted. And like they'd go to Dunkin' Donuts and they'd work there, and then when Circle opened at 10 o'clock at night, they'd play through the night. But one guy, like, it was a Trek or something, which was 3-dimensional wire figures where you could...
You're thinking about Space Sim. That was one of
Space
you. Yeah.
Okay, Space Sim. Anyway, so one guy, it was really cool because, I mean, for me, like one spaceship would be upside down relative to the other, so you're not fighting, it's like any direction. And one guy who had been, quote, a gamer sort, later got a job as a draftsman because he got his training from basically playing this game. And so that, to me, was an epiphany that these games really did have, if you wanted, some social utility beyond just playing it. It was interesting. And
It certainly improved typing skills.
Yeah. Oh, yes. And then another thing I mentioned to John was that sometimes the PLATO system would have problems, and they'd have to go to a backup of 3 days earlier or something. Anyway. So they lose you might lose 3 days of programming or something like that. But the whole Empire game with all of its progress would be lost, and they'd go back in time. It was like really going back in time. The whole game was kind of
The game and those records, the Hall of Fame records.
There's a question at the back, a gentleman with the orange shirt. We have another, we only have one more. Oh, there's another mic. Okay. Oops, I'm sorry. Did I miss
Thank
someone?
you. I didn't actually have a whole lot of experience with PLATO growing up. My dad here did, so he had me learning educational games growing up, probably inspired by PLATO. But my actual question is more of a personal question in that I had a programming class in high school where our project for the semester was to write a game. So I chose a rather classic game called Missile Command. And I was curious what curious bugs or interesting features that accidentally occurred as creating one of your games. Like, for example, in mine, I was having a decision whether or not to make the laser beams that went out to destroy the bombs be fixed-length lasers, a la Star Wars, or whether they should extend from a fixed point out to the bomb like a traditional laser would. I ended up using the fixed point and extending out, but as I was doing it initially, I was using the fixed-length laser, and I ended up making a calculation error such that my laser would orbit around the point at which you tried to send the laser to.
Any famous bugs?
So my question is what kind of curious things happened in one of your games?
Well, I can mention a curious thing that happened in Avatar. So PLATO, the hardware itself, what you can think of as a platform, then the software ran on the hardware, and that's a platform too. Avatar itself was a platform. It's a data-driven game. We didn't do this, but you could have had very different games with different data in the same code. So these things all get used in unintended ways. Avatar was probably not envisioned at all when they started PLATO. So, of course, things happen in Avatar that we did not envision. One of those things was somebody wrote a thing called an autospeller. So what that was is it was a bot that was written in the 8080 assembly language. It intercepted commands. It sat at a special place in the dungeon where there was a lot of traffic, and you could tell it to throw a magic spell on you. So you would tell it the spell name, and it would throw the spell on you. So we did not anticipate this at all. If we wanted this, we would have put it in the game. It wasn't too unbalancing, so that was okay. The autospeller itself is a platform, and the autospeller authors did not anticipate something either. If your name was 001 and you told the autospeller teleport, you could cause the autospeller to go into solid rock.
What do you mean going solid rock?
Pardon?
I'm not sure what that means.
You could send a message to the autospeller, this bot that's a player in the game, and you could say teleport. And if the name of your player was 001, that's your name, it would move the autospeller, the bot, into a place in the dungeon that's solid rock, and it would kill it.
Brand.
Yeah, thank you.
Quickly, and then we're
very quickly. An inherent thing about flight simulations is it involves finite difference equations, and it wasn't until I had graduate school and had several courses in finite difference equations I found out how to do it right. So in any flight simulation, it's going to do crazy things. And instead of admitting to the user that, well, you crashed because my finite difference equation went unstable, what I in fact did, and I don't think anybody knows this, I would flash up a screen saying, you exceeded the G limits of your airplane. Here are the pearly gates, and I would bounce you out to Space Sim, which was the space simulator.
Yeah.
So, and I never did tell anybody. It was just because I hadn't taken the finite difference course.
Yeah, well,
we have a question back here.
Yes, sure. Brand, you had mentioned earlier that people would play the game according to what was possible.
Right.
Rather than what you had originally intended, and that those who knew the exploits would be the ones who would be able to achieve victory in the game. And this probably applies to the games that all of you produce. I'm interested in hearing from the panel both the gaming aspects and the social aspects associated with cheating, or is cheating even possible if you're simply taking advantage of what's available within the game?
That's an issue that I had early on because being at Iowa State, we had 2 terminals in the building, and I did not anticipate that somebody would have more than one logon, for example, which turned out to be false, but in my case, that seemed reasonable. So I never caught on to this fact that people would log in on another team and fly a different team, fly over, take their shields down, and let their other player themselves on a different one kill this one. And I saw a guy do that once at Iowa State, and I argued with him. I said, "This is not right," And he said, "But the game allows me to do that." And I have a difficulty understanding how to develop anything to stop that, but it always bothered me that somebody would cheat that way, because that's not the way the game was designed. It was designed for one person to one terminal, and everybody else needs to be real as well. And of course, Empire and Avatar had a variety of bots developed over the years to help enhance the player's capabilities. All which was not intended either, but I thought was very creative that people came up with those.
I got that
So
same
I'd
cheater
like
right
to-
now, I think. I think the same guy's cheating on one of my games right now.
Yeah. I can tell you his name afterwards.
Empire had a very interesting bug.
Go ahead.
Empire had a thing called the torp buffer. So there's a limited number of torpedoes you could put into the torp buffer.
150, yeah.
Okay. See, I was not one of the ones cheating, so I did not have to know that. So I was a Klingon. There was a thing called an Empire tournament where 15 of one team would play 15 of another team, and they'd meet in the middle of the night and play all night. It was an awesome time.
We have a picture of one of those coming up.
Yes, great. So one time in an Empire tournament, the Orions decided that they were going to do a denial of service attack on the torpedoes. So they filled up the torp buffer, and the Klingons were very surprised at this because they couldn't fire any torps, and so it helped them some. I don't know that it helped them enough to win, which they would have needed some. But
This, by the way, is a really good example of a tournament game. Empire was rewritten or added to by Steve Peltz to make a tournament option where you could set up scenarios and have teams against each other. This is typical in the sense that you see all the Federation ships running away from the Klingons.
Will everybody join me in thanking our panelists? This was really great.